When a harmless fantasy turns out to be the beginning of a horror trip, this young couples must free themselves off the shackles. Jesse and Gerald, a couple plan on going for a weekend trip to a secluded lake house. With a little bit of tension on the way, they come across a stray dog. Jesse expresses her heartfelt concern for the dog, but Gerald disappoints her by abandoning the dog. They finally arrive at their beautiful lake house set in the middle of nowhere. Just as they unpack, Jesse takes a piece of meat from the fridge and then proceeds to call out the stray dog. The stray dog appears, but it runs back out of fear when it sees Gerald. Having other plans for Jesse, Gerald asks that she leave the meat for the dog and come with her. He drags her inside with the main door left open. With a Viagra bottle showcasing his plans for Jesse, Gerald cuffs her with a handcuff on his bedpost. He tries to spice up their love life with an assault fantasy. Jesse seems to go along with his plan at first.
Help! Somebody help me.
Oh, come on.
But when things become really intense, she becomes uncomfortable and tells him to stop.
Uncuff me now!
Gerald becomes really angry at her, saying she never makes things exciting, and that is why their marriage is stuck in the same place. Just as he tries to force himself on her again, Gerald suddenly have a heart attack and then collapse, falling off the bed. His head begins to drench in blood as Jesse is left handcuffed and trapped, with no way to reach the key. With time passing, she begins to scream for help, but all to no avail. The secluded area makes it really difficult for people to hear her scream. Just then she notices some movement. Hopeful it would be someone who would rescue her, the stray dog strolls inside the room. He sniffs Gerald before taking a bite out of his arm. This horrifies Jesse as she tries to chase him away.
Get away from him. Back up!
Just then she begins to hallucinate as she sees an imagined version of Gerald, reminding her of how weak she is as a person and her strained marriage with Gerald. The voice in her head keeps telling her that there's no hope for her and she is doomed. Jessie becomes more fatigued due to struggling, and she hallucinates again, this time a more confident version of herself, who tells her the obvious truth about Gerald that she never wanted to believe. The voice tells her to wake up from her slumber and free herself off the cuff as she talks her through her predicament. Just then, she remembers that Gerald kept a glass of water on the shelf above her head. So she struggles to reach for it, but she realizes that she can't drink through because of the cuff. She hallucinates again and remembers the slip she got. So Jessie takes the tag and then turns it into a straw as she drinks water to keep her hydrated and alive. Meanwhile, the dog continues to eat parts of Gerald. Because of her adrenaline level and lack of energy, Jessie falls asleep. Just as night falls, Jessie wakes up to see a horrifying man with bags of bones. Gerald appears again, suggesting that this moonlight man might be a representative of death, and most women die of fear at night after screaming for help. He gives her possible scenarios where she can die, including death from the stray dog. Gerald calls her Mouse, which triggers Jessie's memory of when she was little. A flashback shows us the time she had gone for a family vacation during the solar eclipse. Her dad had asked that they spend a little time together when he is left alone with her. He manipulates her into sitting on his legs while he masturbates. He sexually abuses her, making her believe it was nothing. Jessie finally wakes up, this time with cramps as blood wasn't really circulating well. Gerald appears once more. He tells Jessie that she didn't open up to him because of what happened during the solar eclipse. Ever since then, she has been uptight and refuses to accept the fact that her father was in the wrong. She has been covering up for him despite his shortcomings. She had continued this cycle of repressed trauma in her marriage. After so many hallucinations, Jessie decides to close her eyes a little. A flashback takes us to when Jessie's dad tries to make sure she doesn't spill what happened at the swing. He manipulates a young Jessie into believing that telling her mother would make the tension between them grow. Jessie isn't really in a good term with her mother, so she pleads that her dad doesn't tell. Her father takes advantage of her fears and asks that she keep it a secret without telling a single soul. Just as Jessie wakes up, she sees the moonlight man trying to eat her feet. She realizes that it is the dog trying to sniff her. So Jessie quickly pushes it away as it goes on to tear up Gerald's body. Gerald appears, pointing out that sooner or later, the moonlight man, who is a representative of death, will come for her and eventually take her. He continues by explaining how long it would take for anyone to notice her. The gardeners and every worker were given the weekend off, as Gerald had wanted to spend some alone time with his wife. In another flashback, Jessie is confronted by her childhood self. She is asked to remember what happened after her father had tried to manipulate her. Jessica's mom had returned home for dinner, and just as they were about to eat, Jessie cut her hand on a glass cup, which her father had to attend to. Back to reality, Jessie thinks about the idea of using the glass to set herself free, but Gerald's voice tries to let her know that she can bleed to death since she is so dehydrated. But Jessie is rather willing to take a chance than to die at a spot. She reaches for the glass water on top of the shelf as she smashes the glass with her already tired hands. She sticks a piece of sharp glass on the wood and then uses it to slice open her wrist, creating enough lubrication from the blood to slip her hand from the cuff. During a gruesome scene, her skin peels off as a result of the pull pressure. She quickly rushes to get the cuff keys as she unlocks herself from the cuff with the stray dog watching. She rushes to get a stink from the tap as she uses a sanitary pad to bandage her already damaged wrist. Just as she tries to get to the car keys, she passes out. She suddenly wakes up at night beside her husband's mutilated corpse. She grabs the car key and then sees the Moonlight Man at the other end of the door. Jessie talks to herself, saying he's not real and wouldn't harm her. So as she gets to the exit door, she drops her wedding ring for his bag of trinkets and then makes her way to the car. Jessie begins to drive and hope that she makes it back in one piece. Before she goes, she sees Gerald waving goodbye at her. Realizing that things could be messy for her while driving, she tries to keep herself awake and in control, but then ends up hallucinating about the solar eclipse and the Moonlight Man at the back of her car. He whispers "mouse" to her ear, resulting in a fatal crash. Luckily for Jessie, she is seen by some nearby neighbors. They rescue her before she passes out again. 6 months later, after Jessie had recovered to some extent, she writes a letter to her younger self with her damaged hand. She had told the cops and doctors that she had amnesia due to the incident, and they believed her because of the degree of injury. Gerald's law firm decides to keep his gruesome death out of paper as life goes back to normal. Well, normal wasn't for her, as every night before she sleeps, she sees an image of the Moonlight Man with his trinket, and thus prevented her from having an actual healthy sleep. The cops had also helped in searching for her wedding ring, but all to no avail. What got her through all these while was the idea of her younger self. Because of her story, she started a foundation to help young boys and girls. Although that helped her during the day, the Moonlight Man still terrorized her at night. However, she sees a picture of Robert Andrew Joubert, who is said to be the Moonlight Man. She suddenly realizes that the Moonlight Man isn't a hallucination, but a real person. He is a grave robber and serial killer who terrorized Louisiana. He stole from corpses and mutilated the dead. He is also responsible for most of Gerald's body part going missing, but Jessie believed it to be the dog back then. During the day of his trial, Jessie arrives at court as Joubert is being arraigned. She calls at him as he breaks free of his handcuffs and mocks her, saying, "You're not real. You're only made of moonlight." Jessie sees Gerald and her father in him, so she tells him, "You're so much smaller than I remember," and then leaves the courtroom feeling fulfilled. The end.
We walk out of this room, and it never happened.